is my pleasure to introduce a man who probably needs no introduction in the Silicon Valley investment community. For those of you who don't know him, you know, we're talking about Bitcoin, we're talking about some of these other companies, but, you know, if I bet we all wish that we were the ones that had written a company like Twitter their very first check. And it just happens that Mike Maples did write Twitter their very first check. And on top of that, he has written a number of successful companies their very first checks. Mike, you had 4 IPOs this year so far, 2 within 1 week of each other. So, all right, so Mike, I'm going to have Mike Maples come up to the stage and join us. He's going to talk to us about his investment. I could call it a thesis, but I'll call it an investment theology. And Mike is a super angel investor. He founded and is the co-managing partner, the managing director of a fund called Floodgate. And if you don't know it, go to floodgate.com real quick and get to know their portfolio so that you know just how big of a heavy hitter we have up here on the stage. So, Mike, thanks for joining us, and welcome back to Punta Mita. You were here last week. So, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Robin. And what? Just quick question. This is forward, the forward arrow?
That's back, and if you want to try it just once, you
okay, just
got it.
We'll do one quick test.
Oh, well, that's always the...
It's a good thing we tested it.
Yeah. I thought you only had one slide. That was the whole thing. No. No está prendido.
Which one? Oh.
There you go. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, so that's forward?
Yeah.
Okay,
and
cool.
that's back.
Let's do one more test. Okay.
Do you really invest in these companies? Do we 2 arrows? Okay.
Okay, there we go. Okay. Okay, so to be honest, I'm a little bit nervous about this presentation because some of these ideas you're kind of seeing sausage being formed, but I thought that they might be useful because I thought that they could capture some of the perspectives that I've seen with some of the really disruptive entrepreneurs and ideas that we've seen, and I believe that one of the things about Silicon Valley that people have talked about, which Ariel mentioned and some other folks talked about, was an appetite for risk. But I also think that there are some cultural sort of thought patterns that I've observed in some of the very best entrepreneurs. And this wouldn't even be a typical Silicon Valley entrepreneur, but some of the best entrepreneurs who've achieved the extraordinary outcomes. And so I thought I would share some of what I think I've seen, and then hopefully we'll have enough time to take some questions. So just for a little bit of a frame of reference, I co-manage a $75 million fund called Floodgate in Silicon Valley. Our primary focus is on finding what I like to call thunder lizard companies. Thunder lizards, I'll just kind of skip ahead, are the metaphor comes from Godzilla. So how many of you have ever seen any Godzilla movies before? Okay, cool. So Godzilla, for those of you who need a refresher, was hatched from radioactive atomic eggs and swam across the ocean and emerges with an attitude, and then begins to devour his startup competitors, gradually becoming even larger and more disruptive, and eventually attacking the incumbents in a market. The incumbents are represented by those train cars that are like sausage links. And, Godzilla always sort of represented to me a great metaphor of the disruptive startup. And what I really want to talk about today is what is it that causes some startups to have atomic eggs? Because Thunder Lizard startups, it's not just about the arrogance of wanting to have a huge outcome or the, look at me, Mr. Ambitious Entrepreneur, I want to have a huge outcome. Thunder Lizards cause immense social good. If you live in Silicon Valley, if you live in Boston near Route 128, if you live anywhere where there has been a technology hub or ecosystem, these companies that achieve the extraordinary outcomes produce ripple effects that are positive in terms of the economy, in terms of culture, in terms of just opportunity for all. And so the reason that I think it would be powerful to consider the possibility of a Thunder Lizard tech company in Mexico is the social good that would cause, the impact that would have beyond the company itself. And so what I wanted to talk about is some of the things that I've seen in that. And I've got a few key ideas. Some of you probably know these already, but I'm just as a kind of set the table. So the first thing that I've seen is important with some of the great outcomes and the asymmetric returns is this notion of exponential thinking. And there are really two thoughts behind it. The first is something we're probably all familiar with. So how many of you have heard of Moore's Law before? Okay, so most of you. So Moore's Law basically states that the performance of computing will double at the same given price every 18 months. And that's basically been true since the late 1960s, and it continues to be true. We often so take it for granted that we forget how magical that really is. You know, Moore's Law is the magic that animates the entire tech industry. Moore's Law is the set of gathering forces that exist underneath us all that allows in any given 10-year time period a new supply of awesome disruptive companies to emerge. The compound interest in Moore's Law is the asymmetric weapon of the startup attacker. And Moore's Law tells us that no matter how big an incumbent is, no matter how large their incumbent advantage is, give Moore's Law time, and there will always be a new disruptive force that will overtake any incumbency. And so that's the first big weapon that we have at our disposal. But you'd be surprised how few startups can articulate the why now part of their business. You know, every startup makes history, but is partly made by history. Every great startup is able to understand in what way did I leverage some kind of a tectonic shift facilitated by Moore's Law. Moore's Law, I believe, has created every major technology. I guess it didn't translate so well from my Mac, but it's animated every major technology wave since the era of the PC. Okay, the second term that I think is probably less. So how many of you all know what a power law is? Okay, so not quite as many. The power law basically states that the biggest outcome will be bigger than all of the others combined, and so on. This is a very counterintuitive law for investing. I have not seen any other kind of asset class where this is true. Most asset classes that I see talk about having a diversified portfolio, and returns are somewhat normal in their distribution. And this is one of the things that I just find vexing and subtle and frustrating and compelling all at the same time about tech startups. The power law in practice, 10 to 20,000 companies will get started in any given year that get angel funded. About 1 to 2,000 will raise venture capital, and I like to say 1 to 200 of them won't suck, which means they'll exit for more than $50 million. 10 plus or minus 5 will be special, but this is the one that blows me away every year. The best company of the year will be more valuable than all other 9,999 combined. Twitter will be more valuable this year than all other startups started the year Twitter was started. And the year that Facebook went public, Facebook was more valuable than all other startups that were started in the year Facebook was started. That just blows me away, right? And it's just like, how do you even get your head around that as an investor? Because if you don't get your head around that as an investor, my belief is you have no business investing in tech startups. Because this is the fundamental asymmetric weapon of the investor and the startup. And just to give you an idea, so this has happened to me too. Like intellectually I grasped the idea of a power law. But you know, in my angel fund, I had investments in Twitter, Yumi Networks, which ended up going public, Aggregate Knowledge, which just exited a couple of weeks ago, Dig, and most of those made money. In fact, some of them made good money. Some of them made more than 10 times their money. None of them mattered next to Twitter. Because Twitter is now 750 times in the money. And so if I had done only Twitter and everything else went to zero, the net effect on my returns would have been zero. And if I had not done Twitter and done all those other things, it wouldn't matter. The fund dynamics wouldn't even be close. In the first fund that I had, one company by itself, Demand Force, returned 2.5 times the fund on its own. And so, you say, okay, well, what other companies did you have in that fund that you invested in? The ones that made 2x, 3x, 5x, whatever, doesn't matter. What makes a successful fund in startup investing is, does your best company more than return the fund? Paul Graham at Y Combinator tells me that Dropbox is more valuable than all of the other Y Combinator classes and startups combined. More than 550 companies that they funded. The next most valuable company, Airbnb, is more valuable than all the subsequent companies remaining combined. And so this is what I find to be the most subtle part of investing in startups. It's the challenge of an entrepreneur is, can I use the asymmetric power of Moore's law to create one of the 10 best outcomes of the year? And if somebody does that, then we get an extraordinary outcome. And as an investor, my job is to recognize that I'm a practitioner of those curves, that I'm not a practitioner of a balanced portfolio with a normal distribution of outcomes, that it's all about having one or two companies in your portfolio that have the Thunder Lizard asymmetric massive return. And I would assert that if you're not thinking about it that way as a venture capitalist, you're not going to be successful. And I would assert that if you're not thinking about it that way as an entrepreneur, it will be hard for you to have an outcome that is worthy of your talent and sacrifice. Okay, so then the second part is, well, how do you sort of operationalize that thinking? It's one thing to say, okay, Moore's law exists and power laws exist, and we as entrepreneurs and humans don't naturally think that way. But what would we do about that? Like, how can we harness that insight? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about linear versus exponential thinking. And so we are programmed in our bodies because of our evolution to think linearly. We do a set of things every day, and in fact, linear thinking is what governs and animates most of what we do. When we brush our teeth in the morning, we don't sit there and say, gee, philosophically, should I be brushing my teeth? No, you just brush them. You drive to work, you just do things because that's how they're done and that's the most effective way, and it makes sense. But exponential thinking is not intuitive. Linear thinking, another example. If I drop this thing, which I won't because then the slides won't work, but if I drop this thing, I know that it's going to accelerate on its way to hitting the ground according to the square of the time that it falls. And you can explain that to somebody, and they can be reasonably smart and roughly understand that. That kind of makes sense. But when Einstein posited his general theory of relativity, a lot of people thought he was smoking weed. There was no way to validate a lot of his theories even in a lab. It took the better part of a decade to even construct experiments that could prove or disprove his ideas. Some of you may even remember the idea of what Einstein used to talk about in terms of a thought experiment, because thought experiments would be like, imagine you're in an elevator going at the speed of light upward. What would happen if you shined a flashlight upward? Intuitive reasoning comes from the era of Isaac Newton. You do an observable experiment, and you have intuitive and tangible results. Einstein evolves from thought experiments that are more counterintuitive and abstract and harder to prove in a tangible way. Typically, what I see from entrepreneurs is reasoning by analogy. And reasoning by analogy is sort of the idea of copying a known recipe that works and modifying it in a certain way. Whereas the ones that I've seen have the massive asymmetric returns usually start with some kind of a first principle and reason up from there. And I'm going to give a few examples of that in a minute here. First example, reasoning by analogy. the case method of analysis. I have nothing against this. You know, I went to Harvard Business School and I learned a lot from case studies, but I find that case analysis is not useful for formulating the initial idea. Once the company's in flight, it could be useful for pattern matching and making good decisions, but it's not a good framework in my experience for figuring out what the disruptive force will be to begin with. The second thing that people talk about these days is lean startup and customer development sort of religion. Once again, nothing wrong with that once a startup is in flight. But you know, I've had a lot of pitches recently where the entrepreneur will say, well, I'm a lean startup. And that's kind of their lead message. And I'm like, okay, that's great, but like what first principle are you questioning? And then they're like, well, I'm a lean startup. I'm going to fail fast and, you know, experiment a lot and, you know, do customer development and minimum viable product and, you know, all that stuff. So here's an example of first principles reasoning, Bill Gates. So I was there at the UT computer library, which he built basically, or he donated money to build. And he was given a speech about back when he started Microsoft. And one thing that he said during his speech that really struck me was, you know, when I was a kid, everybody in the world thought computers were expensive. And you didn't question that computers were expensive because they just were, right? Questioning computers being expensive would have been like questioning gravity in the year 1974. You just would have assumed that it was a truism. Well, Gates was programming computers in the lab in high school, and he and Paul Allen had the insight that someday they would be cheap. And if you have that insight that computers will be cheap and that they'll be everywhere, then you have the ability to recognize that software is an industry. And people don't realize it now. Like, we take so for granted that software is an industry that we don't realize that in 1975 what a profound fundamental insight that was. To think that software could even be an industry, much less that it could be something more valuable than hardware, and that someday there'd be a computer on every desk and in every home running software. But you know, Bill Gates didn't start Microsoft and say, there's a big pain point I solve, or computers are broken, or, you know, what you often typically see when you see a reasoned by analogy startup pitch. What he instead did was question a first principle. He said, I question the principle that hardware is expensive. And if the relative importance of software and hardware flip-flop, what kind of a company would you start then? So diagnostic test number one for an exponential company is most of the world believes X, but the truth is not X. And so this is often a question that I ask entrepreneurs when they pitch us, is in what way are you non-consensus and right? And why are you non-consensus and right in such a way that is informed by your unique proprietary insight of a technology change? You know, anybody can be non-consensus, but being non-consensus and right in a meaningful way should be by virtue of some type of specific knowledge that you have on a technology trend. Okay, the second one, and it's funny because I owe Ariel a big debt of gratitude on this one. So I remember this was in 2005. I was really interested in podcasting, and so I just met Ariel, and we're having coffee downtown Palo Alto on University Avenue. And I'm like, this podcasting thing's going to be big. And Ariel's like, I know, it's going to be awesome. Well, I'm working with this company called Audio, and I was like, I know, and I think they're so cool. And, you know, could you introduce me to the guys? And so Ariel introduced me to, well, kind of at the same time, Ariel and then Jeff Huber over at Google introduced me to Ev. And so I got to meet Evan Williams and then Noah and Jack and all these other guys who were involved with a company called Audio. Well, the week after we put our money into Audio, Apple announces, so Audio was a podcasting company. And the week that we invest in Audio, literally the same week, right after our money goes in, Apple announces that they're going to give podcasting away on iTunes. And, you know, when that happens, you kind of got a problem because there was only one MP3 player, which was the iPod. And so you're like, okay, let me get this straight. Every single iPod, which is every single MP3 player, basically is going to have podcasting for free. And we just started this company, or we just invested in this company that's going to try and make a business out of this. So Evan struggled for about a year to turn it into something. And And one day he's just like, you know what, we just don't have a business here. There is no solution to this, and so I'm just going to give everybody their money back. So I'm going to give every investor their money back. And so, so I'm like, well, you don't owe me anything. I took this risk. That's venture capital. And he goes, no, some of the investors are demanding that I give them the money back. I was like, okay. So, so I said, well, that's fine. I'll take it back, and under one condition, you let me invest in your next thing. And he says, well, I got this thing on the side, and I'm not really sure what to call it. I'm trying to figure out. I think he was calling it voicemail 2.0 for a while. So it was voicemail 2.0 or Twitter, and it had no vowels. Twitter without the vowels, yeah. So I was like, okay, yeah, okay. Well, what does voicemail 2.0 Twitter do? And he says, you say what you're doing. And I'm like, okay, that's what happens. Then what happens? He's like, that's it. He's like, oh no, I forgot to tell you, in 140 characters or less, because we want to be on cell phones. And I was like, okay. And well, is there a revenue model? And there is no revenue model. Is there a roadmap? There is no roadmap. And I'm like, okay. Why do you think this is a company, Ev? Why is it even a product, much less a business? He goes, well, first of all, I really don't know if it is. But he goes, here's my theory. My theory is that, I had a company before called Blogger, and about 1 million people wrote blogs before we were acquired by Google. And then I went and did this podcasting company, and let's just set aside the fact that Apple ran us out of business. Even if they hadn't, it's kind of hard to do a podcast. You have to record your voice, you have to put it up there, you got to do an RSS feed, you got to have subscribers. So I thought I would just go in the opposite direction. I figured that if 1 million people write blogs, maybe 10 million people would write microblogs. And if 10 million people write microblogs, the burden of proof is on the people who are negative about this idea. And so this was, kind of first principles at work, was that I don't have to know how the dots are going to forward connect. As long as I know that I'm doing something that challenges a first principle in such a way that if it's right at scale, there will be multiple routes to getting lucky and routes to money and routes to being meaningful. But you kind of have to take that leap of faith. I like this Venn diagram. Actually, I got this idea from Peter Thiel, and it's sort of a variation of what Courtney was talking about earlier. But it's sort of the intersection of three things, like what can I uniquely do, what's valuable, and what's nobody else doing, right? And the intersection of that Venn diagram is what valuable company is nobody building yet. And so that was the lesson I learned from Ev, was that, not only did he have a non-consensus and right view, but he understood the intersection of something that he knew about that nobody else was yet doing, that had the potential to be valuable at scale. Okay, this is my favorite example. So Elon Musk. Most people think that SpaceX is a more efficient version of NASA. But actually, I don't think that's true. I think that Elon had a fundamental insight, and I saw him talk about this one time. He said that, when you think about a rocket, the cost of the fuel in the rocket is only 0.3% of the cost of a space trip. And the rest of the cost of the rocket is what gets destroyed in space when it disintegrates. And so if I could make a reusable rocket, I could have rocket travel be 10 to 100 times more cost effective than it is today. So to me, what's exponential in Elon's reasoning has nothing to do with whether SpaceX can build a rocket more efficiently or cost effectively than NASA, because that in and of itself would not have been enough to be a truly exponential idea. The exponential part of his idea was rethinking a first principle about rocket travel in such a way that if you're right, you have an order of magnitude improvement at least in the value proposition. So diagnostic test number 3 is, what is your big secret? Which is another question I like to ask the entrepreneur. Okay, for people who want to delve into this a little bit more, there's a good talk that Elon gives at the TED conference that explores these topics a little bit more. Okay, so the last big point, and then we'll wrap up, is that exponential outcomes require a fundamental advantage. And so most people, like when I went to business school, if you'd said, what is capitalism? Most people would have said something like, capitalism is a form of economic behavior where people compete over limited resources and for the customer's share of dollars and wallet. It would have been something like that. But I actually think that capitalism and competition are actually opposites. And so, to me, the right way to think of a capitalist is a person who gathers capital. And a person who gathers capital based on their unique competitive advantage. This is something that most entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley get wrong, in my opinion. They engage in mindless competition. And they don't realize that the best competitive strategy is to not compete. The best competitive strategy is to realize that being the one and only is the best competitive strategy. I call it Jerry's Law. And so how many of you have ever been to a Grateful Dead concert or heard Grateful Dead music? Yeah, so one of the things I used to love about Stanford was they'd play there every year. And you'd go see the Grateful Dead. And one time I saw Jerry Garcia interviewed. And they were saying, there's so many rock bands and, people are so excited about the Grateful Dead. And what is it about the Grateful Dead that makes you better or more exciting than all these other bands that causes you to have such a following? And he said, I don't try to be the best, I try to be the only. And to me, that's Jerry's Law of capitalism. The reason Twitter and LinkedIn are valuable is there's only one such company that does what they do. Same is true of Facebook. The reason that I invested in Rally was it was the only cause economy idea I saw that had a built-in inherent set of strong network effects at scale, if it works. And so, paradoxically, the best, most valuable internet companies that I've seen, and tech companies by extension, are companies that, well, I try not to use the word monopoly. My dad used to work at IBM and Microsoft, and he said, be real careful of that word. Sometimes you can offend people when you use that word, or it can come back to haunt you someday. So I don't invest in monopolies, and I don't endorse monopolistic behavior, but I do like to invest in companies that try to be like Jerry Garcia, that try to be the only example of what they do in their space. And, whenever you do a slide set as an entrepreneur, and it has, here's my 10 checks versus my competitor's 5 checks, it's axiomatic to me that you're thinking about your business the wrong way if you want to be a huge disruptive outcome. The best entrepreneurs I see compete by not competing, and they participate in capitalism by gathering capital based on their proprietary advantages. So perfect competition, it turns out, is not perfect. And the best strategy is to transcend the competition. And the other thing I found is that, I should have mentioned this earlier, distribution usually flows from the competitive advantage. There's something married tightly between the distribution strategy and the product. Usually the product itself is distributable. And if you look at most great successes in tech history, most of them had some unusual disruptive attack vector for how they got distribution. Okay, so parting thoughts. So that says a legendary exponential company in Mexico. And so the real reason I'm interested in spending time here is I would like to see, I believe that in the last 10 years, innovation has been democratized. I believe that the cost of starting a company has collapsed, that the ability to experiment and prove or disprove an idea has fundamentally changed. And I think that democratizing innovation, we're only seeing the first phase of it. The first phase was lean startups, bootstrapped, get minimum viable products, that kind of stuff. But when you make the cost of starting a company as low as it's becoming and it declines, you democratize innovation. I believe that in the next 10 years, we will see the first female Mark Zuckerberg, for example, because there will be fewer barriers to women serving women with technology products and services. I believe that in the next 10 years, we will see legendary disruptive companies form outside of Silicon Valley, Thunder Lizard companies that are valued in the billions and the tens of billions, and if we get things right, the hundreds of billions. And that's really my manifesto, right, for Mita. I mean, the reason I'm interested is if I can play a small part in helping the Mexican entrepreneurial ecosystem come to the conclusion that it can be done, that we can be involved with companies that create tens of billions of dollars of wealth for not just entrepreneurs, but for the ripple effects that it would create in the economy. It's going to take some time, and it's a set of values that are really different from starting a typical company. But I think it's worth pursuing, and I would like to partner with people down here who have this same philosophy. You know, any great narrative and any manifesto is a call to arms, where it's more of a movement than one person's ideas or one person's set of opinions. And so, you know, those of you who are interested in this, I hope that we can work together, because I think that you know, the social good that would be caused by one $10 billion company in the next generation in this area would be incalculable. So with that, I probably should stop talking, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, or if anybody wants to call BS on anything, that's fine too. Yeah.
We have about time for about 2 questions, and then we got to move on to the next panel. So if someone's quick to the draw over here.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for the talk. Great talk. I completely agree with you in the exponential growth, and that investors need to look for an exponential growth company. However, I think that applies more to Silicon Valley than to Mexico. I think that Mexico still needs some linear growth stories, right? And not aim for the $1 billion or $500 million, more for the 20, 30, 50, $70 million exits, right? And that will build an ecosystem which future companies can build upon and get a $1 billion exit, right? What's your view on this, you know, short-term view for Mexico?
Yeah, so I guess the question is what I'm saying that means that linear companies are no good or that we don't need those? You know, it's funny. I once saw a movie where Clint Eastwood said, "A man's got to know his limitations." And I have a very specific model for how I invest and a very specific formula that I look to for success. My formula is not the only right one. And, you know, there are great entrepreneurs doing linear startups in Mexico and in Silicon Valley, by the way. I would say 1 in 500 entrepreneurs I meet in Silicon Valley thinks truly exponentially. But the other thing I know is that I only feel competent to opine on the kinds of companies I fund. And so I'm perfectly happy to see, excuse me, linear startups in Mexico and Silicon Valley, just like I think it's great to have non-tech companies, and just like it's great that my uncle, you know, runs a sporting goods store. But I don't feel like I have any expertise on it. You know, I think that and I try to tell the entrepreneurs that I work with that, you know, I try to say, work with me if you want to have one of the top 10 startups of the year. That's what I'm in it for. That's what I care about. That's what I know about. I wouldn't even know how to give advice on the other way. And so that doesn't mean it's not valid. It just means that I don't feel competent to offer much.
Thanks for your talk, Mike. That was great. On the Jerry's Law part of it, do you define? So earlier in our panel was asked, you know, about clone companies, right? So if you're not, you know, don't be the best, be the only. Are you in your mind? Are you redefining what the only means when you start looking outside of Silicon Valley for these investments? So I look, for example, at Rocket in Europe, right, making all these investments on the only new, you know, Amazon of Latin America, right, Linio. Well, yeah, they are the only. They're not Amazon,
right,
but they're the only in their markets. Is that a valid investment strategy for you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, so here's the thing. Like, I think startups, when they start out, are sort of like a baby wildebeest on the Serengeti plain, right? And there's Nubian vultures above them, and there's hyenas and jackals and lions and cheetahs and all this stuff. And so when you're a startup, you need to have the advantage of not having a bunch of predators chasing you. And so how do I think about when something's the only? There are a couple ways. One is if you just have a non-consensus and right view of something, and you get critical mass before the rest of the world sees it, and your scale becomes a competitive weapon and advantage. I would argue that's what Amazon did back in the early days. You know, you wouldn't have looked at Amazon initially and said there was something intrinsically defensible about it. That's way number one. Path number two, I think, is to have a technology that's so deep it can't be replicated. For example, if you really had the cure for cancer and you're the only person, your market risk is zero. And you'd be the only. And then the third way, I think, is to have a network effect with strong network effects between the nodes on the network and some way to monetize the data that gets gathered in the process of the network being formed and running at scale. You raise a valid point. You might be able to construct such a network or such an advantage in, say, Brazil or Mexico. And so I guess I would define being the only as a more precise way to be defining it would be to say, I look for an absence of competition. When that entrepreneur wakes up in the morning, are they worried about jackals and hyenas and vultures, or are they just worried about getting up and walking? And, the startups that have time to get up and walk unmolested are the ones that usually do the best, because they've got enough stuff to worry about without worrying about all the predators around them.
Thank you, Mike.
Thanks.
Stay up there. Mike, you stay up there. We'll have our VC panel guys come on up.
Yeah. So we're the idea of this panel is VC funding and cross-border startups, and probably just to kick it off because I know we're kind of going at a fairly quick cadence. Why don't I just invite all the panelists to introduce themselves and just sort of their frame of reference on this topic of venture investing in Mexico and as it relates to Silicon Valley. So why don't we start with Lynn?
When I had the pleasure of moving to Mexico 5 years ago, I looked at this country at an inflection point, which many people have spoken about, and which I think is very tangible and visible to us all, and saw the leapfrogging that we've also witnessed in many technologies. You don't need landlines, you have cell phones, et cetera. And began to think about the opportunity that Robin and Lynn are creating by connecting people and purpose and resources across the borders, and seeing this as an enormous opportunity, as you said, Mike, to make a big impact on a country in a world that is ever smaller.
My view on this is that there's so much opportunity for disruption in so many industries that technology is changing the landscape. And I do think, and I take the challenge that Mexican entrepreneurs are ready and they are working on very big, significant problems. We're also educating many thousands or millions of entrepreneurs as well. Because we're a very young country, and building this infrastructure in Mexico will allow to create a ripple effect where all of these kids will, for the first time, be allowed to dream, take risks, and have a place where they can get, someone can hear them and they can get support by merit, independent of who you are or how much money you have. Now, Mexico plays a big role in Latin America, but also in the connection of in interaction with the strongest economy in the world. As someone said in one of the previous presentations, is the second biggest partner of the U.S. And I think it's on the strategic interest of the U.S. to keep building this economy. We are investing in Mexican entrepreneurs, and one of the things that I like to see about this is that what we're pursuing is that we're helping our entrepreneurs design solutions in Mexico, and sometimes we manufacture them in the U.S., in Silicon Valley, because we want to have either the best technology, access to the best technology, or in many cases we don't copy, we leapfrog, as you were saying, because we have other restrictions. And what works in Mexico can work in other emerging markets that have similar environments.
I think what's been said is true, and that creates different alternatives for successful stories. I believe there's in fact this leapfrogging effect, or this catch-up that the Mexican economy needs to make, and that creates opportunities in different services, healthcare services, financial services, educational services. It is also true that Mexico has a geographic position that allows for opportunities both linked to the integration of North America, but also in bringing things to South America. I also think that there is the creation of an ecosystem that allows for a truly disruptive global set of entrepreneurs being born here. So I think, and at least from our perspective as investors, we need to be paying attention to all those alternatives. It is a country with a large domestic market, and it needs to be attended, that there are special needs that happen in Mexico related to those services that need to be covered, and that the leapfrogging brought by technology creates opportunities. But also we will see export opportunities, and who knows, we are all looking for this $10 billion opportunity in the near future. The key is to be paying attention to where's the talent, what kind of solution they're bringing, and invest in those.
Okay, great. So just to put it in context, I want to introduce the first three guys, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves super briefly. So just to put it in context, Lynn Hoffman is on the board of Boston Private Bank and Trust. She's also on the investment committee of a $16 billion sovereign fund. Rogelio de los Santos, he's one of the leaders of the venture capital in Latin America. His fund is Alta Ventures. And Fernando Lelo Larrea is with Venture Partners, and he's developed a little bit of a reputation for himself as being kind of the go-to guy up to this point, for tech. And I'll let you guys battle it out, but tech in Mexico. So that being said, I'm Robin Reyes, and of course I'm here with the Mita Institute. So from our perspective, it's twofold. Really, it is to the opportunity that we see is that to be part of that thunder lizard. We feel that we're best positioned to connect the Mexican entrepreneurs with the kinds of expertise and mentorship that they'll need to get there, that they need along the path. And as they need to perhaps enter the North American market, that we're well positioned to help them with that. On the flip side, we don't want to miss out on an existing, one of those radioactive eggs that's already hatching. So our investment thesis is to provide an access for Mexican investors and our limited partners in our fund to invest in those radioactive eggs, and to through our Mexican network, and that's the broader community. It's not just our investors, but it's our friends that are all here. So through our Mexican network, provide an acceleration, so to make those radioactive eggs even more radioactive, so that they can enter this market more quickly and expand. And we just feel like we're very well positioned to help those companies in that path. So that's our view on this segment.
And my name is Mike Hennessy, and I live in San Francisco, and I think I have a somewhat unique perspective on the market. I've studied in Spain, lived in Mexico and Chile, and I've spent almost all my career in Silicon Valley working with enterprise startups and have been an angel investor the last, I guess, 7 years. So I've got a little bit of a window as a limited into the venture capital world as well. And I've done 3 investments in entrepreneurs that are in Colombia, in Mexico I'm looking at now, but also in Brazil, Chile, and Argentina. And I also act as a mentor and advisor with Endeavor in several incubators that are in Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. So I've got a little bit of a unique perspective on it, and we can get into some of the details later.
Thank you. I'm Albisetti. I work for the IFC World Bank. And the reason why we are focusing on this segment of the market is because we believe in Mexico there is a lot of potential that is rooted in numbers. For example, there is a relatively recent research from Bain on private equity capital that have mapped about 41,000 SMEs in Mexico that are looking for risk capital. And the segment that is attended by the venture capital and smaller private equity is only about 7,000 of these companies who actually have access. So we believe that there is an excess of 30,000 potential companies with great rippling effect, I would say, with the potential of creating employment and not necessarily being disruptive technology ventures, but mainly focusing probably on increasing productivity and introducing innovative products that deserve our attention. So we have found, in conclusion, that if we look for in Mexico today something that can be transformational in the base of the economy, we can look at what will happen, as we said, with the reforms, particularly the effect of the reforms on breaking monopolies like in the energy sector, but we have a fair amount of trust that something transformational can happen, creating new successful SMEs that are innovation-based.
So, let's see, I think, okay. One of them, okay, there we go. So, and so maybe I'll start with Rogelio and Fernando on this question, if you feel comfortable answering it. But you know, as a Silicon Valley guy, we have a pretty well-developed ecosystem. You know, startup company gets started, they raise their Series A, and then they raise their Series B, and then they raise their Series C, and you know, there's a tier of investors that focuses on all those areas. And I've often wondered, if you're an entrepreneur in Mexico, how does that work here? You know, because you know, Lynn and I were talking about this in one of the breaks. You know, it feels like there's all these dots that need to be connected somehow. But I'm just curious about your perspective on how does an entrepreneur think about that right now, and how do they make sense of their different options over time?
You know, the best thing is that entrepreneurs find their way, and they don't need government, and they can be successful with or without us, and that's the beauty of it. But one of the good things about it is that definitely the ecosystem, the big question was, and this was posed like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, is why $1 trillion economy with over 100 million people close on the border with the biggest economy of the world doesn't have this asset class? there were many issues because of many of the business prevention people have been hard at work there. But one of the things that we see is that many people have awakened to the idea of participating, and we're a clear example of that. We have now 30 families, family offices. Some of them don't even have a family office, but they say this is important, and I'm willing to share my mind, my heart, and my wallet with you guys, and let's build this infrastructure. One of the things is that now all of these families are investing to our side. The infrastructure is being built. Right now, we have many more funds than 3 years ago that are investing at different stages. The government has set up some fund of funds to start creating general partners that will operate these funds from seed, venture, growth stage during the funding continuum. But the interesting thing here is that there are a lot of groups that can participate in helping the entrepreneur. What we need is more entrepreneurs to take more risks and think globally and think about big problems that they can solve, because many of them are wasting their time in ideas that are not worth pursuing for themselves and much less for other people's resources or money. And as you move through the funding continuum, we are building and accelerating the infrastructure so that you can keep reducing your financing risk. And by doing that, we're not looking to replicate what's exactly in Silicon Valley. What we need are the core elements that make the richness of an environment like Silicon Valley happen in our context. So, and we have discussed this before, being abundant, thinking global, and in another way, living your ego at your home. Those are very important things that in our, and also being willing to leapfrog and take risks, enormous risks, because that is what makes a difference. When you take those big risks, then and you believe that you can make it, then is when things get aligned and happen.
I agree. I think there are some lessons that can be learned from other asset classes that have evolved in Mexico, and I think growth equity is important as a lesson because we're still at a very fragile stage in the venture capital industry in Mexico, and the way it happened in private equity and growth equity is we had a first wave probably 20 years ago, and the truth is those funds didn't give good returns back to their investors, and therefore they didn't invest again, and we had some dry years for a long time before it came back, and they restructured and they learned again. And now the growth equity market in Mexico is very well attended, so that many of the fund managers have been moving towards earlier stages and have basically covered what I would call Series C in Mexico, the last series of financing before becoming EBITDA positive. So that's one part of it. Public policy has allowed for many seed funds and incubating processes with discovery funds to appear in the ecosystem in Mexico, and that starts to be well covered as well, as Rogelio was explaining. And I think the gaps to be filled are right now right in the middle, Series A and B, and that's where we both are attending to. We're putting our attention to make sure that that's filled. But again, we have to be very conscious that we are having some money by institutional LPs, international LPs being trusted into us, and we have to make sure that we give those returns. So just to emphasize, we're at a fragile stage. We need to make sure that we're making step-by-step progress, and we need for funds to return good investments. In the US, in more mature markets, if a fund, because of looking for very disruptive startups, ends up writing them all off, well, nothing happens to the system. Right now in Mexico, if one of the funds that is playing here sees that scenario, it's going to seriously affect the availability of resources going forward. So you have to find that mix. You have to make sure that you're having hits and doubles before, or looking for the home runs, but making sure that you have those hits so that international investors continue gaining confidence in the Mexican market. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that.
I think Rogelio's comment about building a funding continuum is very important in an area in which Mexican government policy has been very enlightened. And I noticed that the largest bank in Mexico announced that they will spend $2.6 billion in partnership with startups between now and 2016. So there is available capital, even for the riskiest end of the spectrum. But what I think is really exciting about Mita, and particularly Mike Maple's involvement as an advisor to Mita, is creating a two-way street between Mexico and Silicon Valley. And it's not an eleemosynary street. It's one that is beneficial to both, because Mexican capital has an opportunity to have access to unique opportunities in Silicon Valley that would otherwise not be accessible. And conversely, those investors have an opportunity for expansion stage companies or for startup companies in Mexico that would not be easily curated or accessible. So I think Mita is a leaping frog.
So one of the interesting things, one of the things that I think would be most productive to see, and you know, the funds that are organized in Mexico that have institutional funding from within Mexico, or some of the the international organizations that sort of put geographic restrictions on it. Of course, we don't want to go all wild, but I think given the sector that we're investing in, I think we could all benefit more from some of those geographic restrictions being eased, so that you guys could take riskier investments, perhaps within Mexico, but be able to put some of your money into, you know, Silicon Valley or other, you know, more mature ecosystems where the risk of investing in those startups is a little bit lower. That way, you don't have to worry about, you know, returning the fund and being so careful right now.
But that's changing, and that is, maybe it started because of the nature of some of our LPs, if they're some of the multilateral development banks that want to build capacity in our countries, no? But we cannot limit the returns for the investors. So in our case, we can invest outside of Mexico up to 20% of our fund. And we can invest in tier one countries like the US. We have Silicon Valley companies, Boston companies, Austin companies, and also in Colombia, in Argentina, and in Central and South America. But here, the important point is that, well, even with now in mid-2009, a lot of the savings of Mexico now are being poured into private sector projects. They started with infrastructure, real estate. Now they're putting it into some of the private equity, and now for the first time a late venture fund. And right now you can only invest in Mexico, but that is going to change next year. And now with the Pacific Rim agreement, their resources can be invested in Peru, in Colombia, and in Chile. That's where we're heading. So there's a lot of money that has to be managed and invested in Mexico.
No, I just wanted to sort of flip this conversation the other way around. We're obviously all investors here. We talk about returns and funds, but I think at the end of the day, it's about the entrepreneurs. It's about their drive, their passion, their willingness to do things. And I want to tell a story. David Weekley's here in the audience. He was instrumental in forming Mexico VC, which is now part of 500 Startups. If you ever get a minute, talk to him about the formation of that. I was in Mexico City about 5 months ago with Santiago Zavala, who was one of the three of them that started that. And he said something to me that just struck me. So David Weekley is an extraordinary hacker. He's at Facebook now. He started his own company. He's done a lot of things. He had Hacker Dojo, and he had a lot of different sites across Mexico where he had a bunch of developers working side by side. And Santiago said to me, he's like, I was so nervous. David brought guys from Dropbox and Box and Twitter. These were my idols. These were my gods. I didn't even think I belonged in the same room with them. So he, sat down, put his computer up next to these developers and started, nervously tapping the keys. And then he's like, you know what, Mike? By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I realized I was every bit as good as those guys. And it was just being able to believe in himself. And I think that's part of it. I mean, I feel like I'm the luckiest guy in the world. I spend most of my time telling people, yes, you can do this. You don't have to copy Silicon Valley. We have 60 years of history with NASA and military, and it's not going to happen that quickly. Use the strengths that are in the country, and you can do this, and you can build companies, as Mike calls them, thunder lizards. It's just going to take time. It's a market cap company, over $4 billion, and that in itself is an interesting story. But what happened is if you look at the 5 or 6 key players in Argentina, the Wences Casares, the Santiago Belinques, the Mickey Melka, they've spawned so many different companies and startups. It took 10, 12 years, but now that whole ecosystem is thriving. I think the same thing's going to happen in Mexico.
Yeah, that was one of the, my favorite book on entrepreneurship ever written isn't really a book on entrepreneurship. It's called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. And it was this book that was written in the early 70s. I don't know how many people have read it, but if there's one message, my dad used to have this book, and I was like in the 6th grade or something. Maybe I was younger when I first saw it, and it was a small book. And I said, "Hey, Dad, what's this book all about?" And he said, "Oh, you should check it out." And so I read this book, and the message I took away from the book was that the limits that you experience in this world are usually not limits that the world puts on you. They're limits that you create in your own mind. They're beliefs that you have that sort of hold you back. And so the thing that I think could really happen in the next few years that would be really meaningful would be this idea of the cross-pollination of, folks sitting next to the Twitter developer, folks sitting next to the Dropbox developer saying it really can be done, right? That creating a huge company, Thunder Lizard, meaningful outcome, not only is it possible, I can make it happen. And, since then I've just become kind of a student of what causes people to have these incredible accomplishments. Like the moon landing in 1969 is another one of my favorites where, it still blows me away. I'll look up at night and there's a full moon and I'm like, we landed on that thing in 1969 before HP invented the pocket calculator. It's just unbelievable to think about. And, what causes people to do that is 2 things. The goal is important and I can make it happen. And when people believe that, that's what causes these hot teams to have extraordinary accomplishments that are unlimited by anybody's definition of what the limits were. And if we can, it's not even about Silicon Valley type of thinking versus any other kind of thinking. It's about limitless thinking, and it's about believing that it can happen and having enough examples in the flesh where it has happened.
Lawrence in Arabia was in his 20s when he led the Arab tribes, a most disparate group, against the Turks. I mean, it's amazing. Youth is an enormously powerful force, and Mexico as a young country has a great deal of youthful talent.
Well, and building an entrepreneur-centric ecosystem, I think, is the key. Instead of focusing on the asset class, let's focus on the dream, the vision, and the energy and positiveness that these entrepreneurs have, and we need to pave the road for them so that they can fly and take off.
Yeah, no, and I just think, sometimes we forget the work that's gone into where we are today. And sometimes it's helpful to take a look back. If you look back 10 years ago in Mexico, there was almost nothing. You had private equity and the guy who said, here's $5 million, I own 95% of your company, you're now my employee. Today, I mean, look at, we've got, 500 startups. We've got Wyra. You've got Naranja Labs. We've got, Andy's got Agave Labs in Guadalajara. Those are just the incubators. Then we've got the VCs. We've got, the banking system hasn't quite come in. Fomin is doing a lot with providing some entrepreneurship. It's just take a look at what's happened in the last 5 years in this country and then project forward. You talked about Moore's Law, it's the same thing. If you just look forward, it's going to be exponential growth. It's not going to be linear growth. So, I mean, there's a reason that I'm here. And I like to check myself, like, where do I go and where do I travel? 5 years ago, it was Chile, Brazil, Argentina. The last 2 years, I've been to Colombia 5 times and Mexico 3 times. So I believe in this market, and I'm very excited about what I see.
Just 2 quick data points. The National Entrepreneurship Institute had an invitation for fund managers to ask for funds, and they approved 14 some weeks ago. But they had requests from 60 groups. So that is a clear signal of what's happening from the investment side. And the other important thing is that now, I don't think that we need to focus only on Mexican entrepreneurs. We have entrepreneurs from all over the world looking for opportunities, looking for growth. And for the first time, I see people from Singapore launching companies in Mexico. And they're interested in Latin America. Latin America as a whole is a very big economy. It's as interesting as India and China.
I wanted to add that anyway, we have still a pretty sizable asymmetry between the world of the demand of the entrepreneurs and where the money apparently are sitting and in some instances are a little bit idle. And I express it with an example that I lived about a month ago. I collaborate as a mentor with Endeavor, as some of us, and I was in the panel in Mexico to select the national panel, the companies, emerging entrepreneurs that go to the next level. Well, in the panel where I was, we studied 7, 8 companies. No one of these companies that were already producing more than $2-3 million of revenues per year have access to this capital. So this is something that we should reflect on.
Yeah, I think there's, Rogelio and Roberto touched on something just now that I think, is good to take advantage of addressing. And one of those things is, so as Rogelio said, we don't need to focus on where the entrepreneur is from, we need to focus on the entrepreneur. Absolutely. We still have a little bit of ways to go on getting the investors to focus on the entrepreneur and not where the entrepreneur is from, because you named a case from Singapore. There's a case that I'm familiar with, and some of the guys are in the room here, where it was a British partner and an Italian partner, and they decided to launch a company in Mexico. They saw the great market opportunity. They came down here, and quite frankly, they struggled early on a little bit with funding. I mean, everybody liked them. They liked the business plan, but there were some questions about who are these guys and where they're going, because they're not from here and I don't know their family. So it's back to us that the investment community, broadly speaking, needs some shifting in their mindset.
Yeah, but they're pioneers. In our case, we have, and these are not jokes, we have 2 Spaniards and a Mexican. We have 2 Russians and a Peruvian. We have 2 Colombians, and we have Argentinians. And I think that they're thinking like immigrants. And that's a big asset for them. And that puts them in a different category, and they see things different. And they're willing to take nothing for granted. And I think that goes to your point there. They don't take the basic principles as something that is a given. They go after something totally disruptive, and they're looking for blue oceans, and they're looking for global opportunities that can get them in the map with the access. First, the opportunity, and then the access to all the infrastructure. And money is not the only thing that is needed. You need access to distribution, you need access to commercialization, to co-investment, and to exits also. We need to create the exits here because we're also trying to build a mid-market public infrastructure there to have smaller IPOs. In the last year, Mexico has had 15 IPOs, and it's a record number. So it's It's also moving in the right direction, but it's going to take time. But we need to disrupt that as well.
I'm just going to do a quick time check here. We're getting pretty close to it. Do we want to open the floor to questions? In the back row? And make sure you let us know who you want to answer the question to.
Okay, well, I'll leave this open to whoever wants to answer it. But I'm Andy from Agave Lab, and I do seed stage investing out of Guadalajara. And the challenge I always run into is I find it easy to do the seed stage because $50,000 is not a lot of money, and people will do that just to support an entrepreneur. But when it comes to a follow-on round, like an A, where you're asking for maybe $2 million or something like that, that starts to sound like real money. And then the question always comes up, well, when do I get this back? And the answer is, well, when we go public or when someone buys us. And then the question is, well, can you show me an example of that happening here? And I don't have a good way of answering that. So it kind of is a conversation killer. And I'm wondering, are there exits, modest exits in Mexico that are happening? And if so, why don't we know about them? Is it because they're not happening? Or are, as a culture, are we just less willing to celebrate those things?
I think the gentleman about 2 tables up from you will say that they are one of those success stories. I think the real issue, and I'll quickly turn it over to someone else, is how we tell those stories.
Well, we have made 19 investments, and we have sold one to Motorola, that it was in the 30 plus million after investing $1.5 million into it. And we have right now 2 more in the works. That one, we already have an acquisition interest from a global company as well. And another one that is maybe not an acquisition, but a merger with some of the biggest players in the market.
But I agree with you. There's the need in the market to share much more information on what's going on in terms of follow-on rounds, in terms of exits. There's certainly been exits by different investors across Mexico for many years. We just have to tell those stories, let them be known. And I completely agree. We need to have a reference of how much this changed in the last few years. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, on any forum on entrepreneurship, we had the same example, Cinemex as a big example of entrepreneurship, which happened 20 years ago. And now it is easier to go to forums where you see different entrepreneurs, some stories that you haven't heard about. And I think that's the right way to go. The effort on gathering information is both ways. We as investors need to share our information. We need to be doing more syndicates and co-investments, and that's starting to happen. So I agree this is exponential, and I'm expecting for the next 2 or 3 years to see many more exits, many more success stories being told, and many more different entrepreneurs in this kind of panels.
Yeah, what I've been hoping to do is encourage a collaboration with Silicon Valley and some of the Mexican funds in the following way. If suppose that you're a family office in Mexico, you may want to invest in funds that seed startups or that do the Series A or the B round. But like you said, there's not a huge number of outcomes yet that you can point to. And so my hope was that if Silicon Valley partners with the Mexican funds in the right way, that family office could invest in a fund that has exposure to both Mexican startups as well as, the next Twitter before it's worth $4 billion on the secondary market. And so, and my hope was that if we get that formula right, that if you're thinking about being an LP in one of these venture funds, that you get to kind of spread your risk and opportunity around some of the local startups as well as proprietary access to some of the Silicon Valley startups. And if we make it more attractive for more LPs to want to get involved, then it sort of stimulates the ecosystem and the funds and so part of it is how do you kickstart? In this environment, VCs need to act like entrepreneurs, not just entrepreneurs need to act like entrepreneurs. And so, there was a time in Silicon Valley where VC was seen as like a fly-by-night, not legitimate job, right? Well, that's not true anymore. But the VCs in the old days, in the 60s and 70s, were entrepreneurs themselves and were entrepreneurial finance people. And so I think that that's going to be a big part of making this work is the venture funds behaving themselves like entrepreneurs and you know, connecting the dots for people.
That's how we got into this space. We're serial entrepreneurs, and this is, in my case, this is my 8th startup. So it happens to be a venture capital platform or an investment platform, but I'm behaving as an entrepreneur as well.
I like the idea of the flywheel effect of bringing two communities of venture capitalists together. And every entrepreneur here has heard about track record. And you know, how do you get a track record when you don't have one? It's like, how do you get your first job when you've never had a job? And one way is through collaboration, through annexation. What track record you may not have, you can build collaboratively by partnering with other funds or other entrepreneurs. And it's a form of portfolio diversification too.
Yeah, and just to comment on that, there's several ways to be successful and to learn how to be successful in the Silicon Valley paradigm. I know a lot of Latin entrepreneurs that are working at companies. They go to Google, whether they're product managers or salespeople or executives, they go to Google, they go to Dropbox, they go to all of these different Valley companies that are really setting the standards of how to develop products, how to sell, how to expand. And that's almost a shorter path, because within 3 years, you're going to have that skill set and that domain, and then you can come back to Mexico with that. I think there's a thought that a lot of entrepreneurs, young Mexicans, feel like, you know, I have to do this my own, I have to be the CEO, I have to do this startup. That's not a bad intermediary path. And then when they bring those skills back here, they're going to train their employees and their local folks about, you know, how things are done. You know, take some of the good, some of the bad, and mix it with the market. So that's just another path to think through.
Now, there are some exceptions to the picture I'm about to paint, but one of the stories that we heard from, you know, from our friends, some entrepreneurs here in Mexico, is to gain that experience that you just described. You know, when you're a student, and it's easier. This goes back to Michael Cominha's immigration, you know, topic. When you're a student and you can get the work visa, it's a little easier to work. You can, you know, spend 2 or 3 years at one of these companies. But then, you know, the whole immigration issue, maybe you can stay longer, maybe you can't. Some of the great first generation or current generation of entrepreneurs here in Mexico, you know, they came out of PayPal, they came out of Adeo, so forth and so on. And so sort of one of the things that we've been working on, and Mike and I, and actually Silicon Valley startup, we actually took this idea, brought it down to Mexico and said, well, let's invest in these companies there in an earlier stage so they can actually have a presence here. And then, you know, maybe instead of the number of top companies that exist in Mexico right now, maybe they're not all Mexican companies yet, but we bring another 10 or 15 of the next top emerging global or US companies into Mexico. Those guys are going to need local talent, they're going to hire, and then that's going to have, you know, the whole social component of the next $10 billion company is that those guys hire people, and if we bring them here, you provide opportunities, exposure, and then you're actually fostering a whole nother generation of entrepreneurs from within here.
Yeah,
So,
and a great example of that is if you look at Nidish Clan Descuento from Chile, which was, you know, Oscar and Danny Undraga. They got acquired by Groupon. At the time, they were 22-ish people in Santiago. They grew all of Latin America for Groupon. And they hired Manolo here in DFA, and he grew a team of 30 people. The number one thing I hear from every single, you know, you go to Chile, you go to Uruguay, you go to Colombia, you go to Argentina, every single one of those startups wants to enter the Mexican market. And every single one of those founders says, I don't know how. It's so difficult. And so I think you're exactly right. If you can provide access to the market, you're going to have another avenue of growth, like you mentioned.
So I think we're a little bit over time, but why don't we just take one more question, and I hate to be between people at lunch, so last question. Anybody? Okay, yeah.
this and that. Hey, thanks, guys. So I was talking with a couple people about this 1 or 2 days ago, about how the VC system works, like Mike said, on the fact that you make 30 investments, right, and you win one that makes up for the rest of the 29. And something we've been talking about, and I don't know Mexico too well, it's actually my first time here, is that Mexican investors are not used to that type of model, right? They're used to kind of, I don't want to say stacking the deck, but like, right, when do I get my money back? And I think when you try and create an entrepreneurial culture with investors coming to the entrepreneurs and kind of making it so that, you know, you enable these things, I don't think the model will look exactly like the US does because of cultural undertows, right? And so I was wondering what you guys thought of that and what you think the model might look like. Maybe, you know, a bunch of people come together to try and mitigate that risk even more and stuff like that.
One of the biggest challenges that I learned about is that when I partnered with Paul that was coming from the US, is that he said when he learned that we valued companies here based on EBITDA, he said, come on, when you have EBITDA, you're ready to do an exit or do an IPO. Huh? Huh? No, sometimes but...
I can't even spell EBITDA.
I know, and our investors are being educated as well in that circumstance. But there is so much opportunity to create venture returns, even in industries that are not capital efficient. In my case, creating a chain of movie theaters, created and selling it to the biggest player in the market, created a venture return type for an industry where you have to invest $500,000 per screen. And there are many opportunities in our portfolio of the 19 companies, well, 18 that we already sold one of them, that we have two. One is in the finance space, and we're just 2 years into it, and now the company is valued close to $90 million, but it's selling 23 million pesos, like $2 million per month, with a 35% EBITDA, positive EBITDA. And we think that company is on track to a lot of our investors like that model because they feel that there is real cash coming out of there and that being reinvested. Many of them, they still are a little bit not comfortable in saying, okay, this is not about selling at all. This is just about building a network, or this is just about creating this infrastructure that is global. And sometimes we get some type of resistance. The other thing is valuations, where some of these investors are not very comfortable coming in at valuations that are at 400 million for a company that is selling $5 million a year, that we see sometimes because we get access to deals from the US. I said, well, maybe it's a different basis of valuation of what they are used to do. But we're moving them into that direction.
Yeah, the thing that I think will be different for the foreseeable future is that in Mexico you can't just raise money to raise money to raise money. You know, in Silicon Valley, and I actually think this is more negative than positive. A lot of companies raise their Series A with an immediate idea to here's how long until I raise my B and then my C, and they just assume the money's going to come just in time, you know, as they get bigger. And you know, it's very empowering for an entrepreneur to think in terms of this may be the last investment I ever get. And sort of the good news in Mexico is there's probably no other way to think about it because that's probably how it is. And so you know, I think that if you say what does that mean for an investor, I think you got to have a bias towards capital efficiency, and you got to have you've got to believe that the company can achieve critical mass without too much money.
A comer. Thank you, Mike.